Good evening and welcome to Festival of the Arts Boca. Thank you for welcoming us into your home for this, our second night of our Authors and Ideas series. And as you can see, I am home and there's my dog right on cue. We are so happy to be with you. We are offering all of our programs for free this year, but without ticket revenue, we certainly could use your financial support. If you would like to make a donation, you can do so easily. You can log on at festivalboca.org/donate and donate on our website. Or if you prefer, send a text to the number right there on the screen, 41444, and in the body of the text, write Boca 21. It is now my great pleasure to introduce to you the driving force behind this series, the chair of our Authors and Ideas series, Cynthia Brown.
Thank you, Joanna. It's nice to have another night with a wonderful speaker. And our speaker tonight is Bruce Feiler, and he is going to be introduced by Marie Speed. But before I get to that, I need to do a little bit of housekeeping. When we come to the Q&A segment, on your screen, if you're looking on the festival website, you can click on Facebook or YouTube, and that will take you to, you can do that now actually and watch live on those two platforms. And then you can write questions, which we'll have plenty of time to answer as many as we can. So I hope you'll do that. So Marie Speed tonight is going to be our moderator, and she is the group editor for the JES Publications, which is all the Boca Raton magazine, Delray Beach magazine, Worth Avenue, and all the Salt Lake City magazines, as well as numerous other publications. So Marie, take it away.
Everyone, I'm happy to get to introduce you to Bruce Feiler, who's written 6 New York Times bestsellers, including Council of Dads, which is that TV series I know we all saw. He's done 2 PBS series, Walking the Bible and Sacred Journeys, and he's written for the New York Times and the New Yorker and Gourmet Magazine, where he won 3 James Beard Awards. He's done TED Talks, he's on radio, he's on TV. He's all over the place. And I think what jumped out at me about his resume, his bio, was he was once a circus clown, which I personally want to hear more about. Tonight, though, he's going to talk to us about this book, which I'm sure everybody signed in here has read, Life is in the Transitions, Mastering Change at Any Age. Just my Vanna White thing. Here it is. He's going to tell us all about what a life quake is and how ordinary people redefine their lives after massive changes. I can't think of a better time to be talking to Bruce Feiler than right now, after the year that we've all had. So I'm not going to keep going on about him. I mean, he's all that and more. Please join me in welcoming Bruce and send in your questions. We'll be taking as many as we can after this is over. Bruce, welcome.
It's my pleasure to be with you. Thank you for those kind words and how happy I am to be back in Boca. And I have to say, seeing those images of beautiful Boca Raton, even though it's 61 degrees here in Brooklyn, where I'm talking to you from tonight, I certainly wish I was with you. And indeed, when I was in the Clyde Beatty Claude Brothers Circus as a circus clown, we actually spent quite a lot of time in Boca, actually playing the Boca Polo Grounds. So some of you may have seen me in whiteface 20 plus years ago, but I'm happy to be back with you tonight. And as you said, and as you've heard all of our hosts remind us tonight, this is an unusual time. It's a moment when we all are going through a period of change, when we're all kind of unsure about the future, and when we now hope and believe are transitioning into the world that will come after the year that we've just all been through, as we reach in the coming days 1 year since we first learned of this pandemic and went into lockdown. And as you said, Maria, what a time to talk about this journey that I've been on and the lessons that I've learned for all of us as we enter these lives and these moments of change. And so what I'd like to do here tonight is tell the story that I've been on and the journey that I've been on in the last half a decade, talking to people about times of change, and then, and perhaps a format that's a little unusual because I think that we are in this unusual kind of virtual format. We want to leave as much time as possible for you to join the conversation. So please, by all means, send your questions in. Maria will be funneling them, and she and I will be having an exchange about them in a few minutes. But let me talk a little about how I ended up in this moment, and I'll begin with this. I used to have a saying that phone calls don't change your life. Until one day, I got a phone call about 7 years ago now that did change my life. It was from my mother. Your father is trying to kill himself. He's what? And suddenly she was talking and I wasn't really listening. And what I began to realize is that my life and my family's life were about to change immeasurably. As a writer, I'm often asked whether I learned to write from my dad. And the answer is no. He was more of a doer than a talker, really more of a teller than a writer. He was a mid-century American man, sort of an iconic representation in my eyes of what it meant to be alive in the 20th century. He was a Navy veteran. He was a civic leader in my hometown of Savannah. He was never depressed a minute in his life until in his 60s when he got Parkinson's. And suddenly, this formidable brain that he had, he began, in effect, to lose control of it. And he got very depressed. And it was at this moment, now in his late 70s, where he began to lose the will to live. And when my family sort of has always been a bit hyperfunctional, and when we were suddenly in this moment, we were dealing with business matters, because I grew up in a family business, and medical matters. But I'm the story guy. For over 25 years at that point, I had been crisscrossing the world, looking at the importance of stories in our lives, whether it was in the ancient world and the oldest stories ever told, to whether it was the stories that we tell around our kitchen table. Stories had always been how I thought about and processed the world. And so one Monday morning, I had an idea. Like maybe stories somehow could get us out of this dark place that we had entered. So I sat down and did the simplest thing imaginable. I sent my dad by email one Monday morning a question. Tell me about the toys you played with as a child. And what happened next changed not only him, but all of us around him. And it led me to rethink what is it that gives us meaning and purpose and joy in our lives. So this is the story of what happened next and what we all can learn from it. So I want to ask everybody who's listening to me here tonight, who's joined us in this virtual forum in celebration of arts and ideas and music and stories, to stop for a second. Stop for a second and listen to the story that's going on in the back of your head right now. It's the story of who you are, the story of where you came from, what's important to you, what matters to you. What's the high point of that story? What's the low point of that story? If you got a call right now that a loved one was in the hospital and you had to rush to meet that person, what would that story be about who that person is and what that person means to you? That story going on in the back of your head, that story is the story of your life. And what we've learned in the last generation is that story is not part of you in some way. That story is you in some way, in a key way, in the most important way, that life is the story you tell yourself. But what happens when you lose control of that story? What happens when you kind of misplace the plot and you don't know how to keep telling that story? What happens, for example, if you're in a moment like we're in now, where suddenly the story that we were telling gets upended or overturned or interrupted in some way? Well, that's fundamentally what happened to my dad all those years ago and to me at multiple times in my life. And what happened to me when it happened this time, the time I was just talking about with my dad, is that I decided to do something about it. I suddenly had a story and I was stuck. I was in effect trapped in the woods and I didn't know how to get out. But this time, I decided to do something about it. This time, I set out to get unstuck. And into that story of how we get unstuck is the story I'm here to talk about tonight. So whenever I tell the story of my life, I begin in my hometown of Savannah, Georgia. So as you all know, that's just up by 95. I don't know, these days you probably can do it in 7-8 hours. From Boca, many of you in fact may have come down from the Northeast and driving down through Savannah. So I grew up in Savannah, Georgia, 5 generations of Jews in the American South. That means I had relatives who fought on both sides of the Civil War. And of course, storytelling, when you come from a place that's kind of sticky and full of stories as the South and being a Jew in the South, these are like 2 storytelling traditions in me that have collided in a lifetime of stories. And so I left the South in the 1980s and I went north to Yale, and from there I went to Japan. So I arrived in Japan in the middle of the 1980s when Japan was on top of the world, and I started writing letters home on crinkly airmail paper. I still have not persuaded my teenage daughters now, that how unusual this was. Like, you would have the paper and there would be the onion skin and there would be no lines, and like the bottom of the pad would have the lines and you'd stick under. So I wrote a series of letters home, like, you're not gonna believe what happened to me. And when I got back to Georgia, 6 months later, everyone said, I loved your letters. And I was like, great, but have we met? And it turned out that my grandmother had Xeroxed them and passed them around, and they went viral in a sort of old-fashioned sense of the word. And I thought, well, if this is that interesting to these people and to all of us, like, I should write a book about this. I didn't know anyone who'd ever written a book, and it doesn't really happen this way, but I sold my first book 32 years ago at the age of 24, and I've never held a job since. So I wrote this book about teaching junior high school in Japan based on my 3 years that I ended up living in Japan. Then I went to England and I wrote a book about that. And then Maria, here's where it came. Having been a teenage juggler in kind of putting myself through high school, as I used to joke, doing mime birthday parties, I joined a circus and spent a year crisscrossing the country doing in 99 cities and 16 states, doing 201 circuses. And as I'm very fond of saying, like, you know, and we had it all. We had tigers and we had elephants and we had bears and we had jugglers and we had tightrope walkers and we had women who hung by the hair. And as I used to joke, when you hang by your hair, you can't have a bad hair day. Anyway, Maria, don't get me telling circus stories tonight. And then I moved to Nashville and I was writing a book about country music. And while I was there, I realized I was living across the street from 3 churches, and I realized that this music of the South was so steeped in the Bible. And I realized I hadn't really read the Bible since I was a kid, so I took the Bible off my shelf. I put it by my bed, where it sat untouched for 2 years, until I went to see a friend in Jerusalem, my friend said, over here's this controversial neighborhood, over here's the rock where Abraham went to sacrifice Isaac. And I realized, oh my gosh, these are real places that you can touch and feel. And so then I set off on this journey where I decided essentially to join the Bible. And I climbed Mount Ararat looking for Noah's Ark. I crossed the Red Sea. I tasted manna. I wrote this book, Walking the Bible, that became a thing and spent a year and a half on the New York Times bestseller list. And this is what I did in my 30s. I went back and forth to the Middle East, writing books and making television about the Bible. And in the context of the conversation that we're going to have tonight, I think of this now as a linear life. Like, I figured out what I wanted to do early. I did it for no money. I had some success. I got married. I had children. Like, this is the fantasy life that we all want. But then, when I reached my 40s, suddenly I was completely bombarded by life. First, at 43, and as a new dad of identical daughters, I was diagnosed with a rare, aggressive form of cancer in my left leg. This was such a nonlinear event that I had an adult-onset pediatric cancer. So I went through this brutal experience where I was on crutches for 2 years, a year of chemo, had a 17-hour surgery in which surgeons took out my left femur, replaced it with titanium, took my fibula from my calf and relocated it to my thigh, where it now lives, and then took out half my quadricep. This was a surgery so rare, only 2 people had ever survived it before me. And that was in 2008. And then that was also the year, as I don't have to remind you, of the Great Recession. And I almost went bankrupt because my family owned some real estate in Georgia. And then a few years after that came this suicide spree that I mentioned with my dad. So suddenly that kind of fantasy fairy tale version of my life was entirely upended. And what happened around that time was a series of events that led me to the conversation and to the journey that I've been on the last 5 years. First of all, I went to my 30th college reunion. And so I live in Brooklyn. So I had actually thrown out my back at the time, and my neighbor was going to drive us up to New Haven for my 30th college reunion. And I figured, you know what? I'll have a chance to catch up with my friend. I'll learn what he's doing. We were unable to talk on the entire ride because he ended up being on the phone because one of his partners in his real estate company had a 9-year-old, and the 9-year-old had gone down the previous day for a nap and never woken up. And so my friend went from closing this deal on top of the world to entirely flattened and bursting into tears. I was narrating or moderating, thank you, a panel of prominent classmates that afternoon at this reunion. And there were 250 people in the audience, and I had all the people on the panel, their resumes all neatly typed. And I was so shaken by this call in the car that I ripped up the resumes. And I said, I don't want to hear about your successes. I want to hear about your struggles. And that night we were in a giant tent. There was a bar on one end and a barbecue on the other. And it took me 2 hours to walk from one end to the other because person after person came up and said to me that they had a similar story. A wife was sick and went to the hospital and died the next day. A child was cutting herself and struggling with an anxiety disorder. My boss is a crook. My brother was diagnosed with stage 4 cancer. I'm suffering from an addiction. And what everybody was saying, in one way or the other, is that the life I expected is not the life I'm living. I'm living life out of order. And I called my wife that night and I said, no one knows how to tell their story anymore. I have to do something to help. And what I did was I created this thing that I came to call the Life Story Project. I crisscrossed the country, collecting what became hundreds of life stories of Americans of all ages, all walks of life, all 50 states. People who lost homes, lost limbs, lost children. People who changed careers, people who changed religions, people who got sober, got out of bad marriages, and people who went through everyday acts of transformation. In the end, I had 1,000 hours of interviews, 6,000 pages of transcripts. The actual transcripts reached the shoulders of my then adolescent daughters. And then I did something I had never done before. And in some ways, this was the oldest thing imaginable, like go and talk to people. But then I did this kind of newfangled thing, which is I got a team of 12 people, and we spent a year combing through stories, day after day, story after story, looking for themes and ideas and takeaways that could help all of us when we reach these moments of change. This was a fully kind of consuming experience because what I realized is that the way we think of our lives is changing, and yet the way we talk about our lives is not. And there was a massive disconnect, and I had to explore what it meant to go through what I quickly realized was a quickening pace of change and some changes that come out of nowhere and transform our lives. And sure enough, I worked on this book for half a decade, and yet it arrives in the middle of a global pandemic when all of these ideas suddenly came flooding into the world. And so what I want to do here for the next few minutes is talk a little bit about what I found and how I think it could help all of you and your family and your loved ones and your colleagues and your neighbors and your friends as you face this tumultuous moment of change. Let me begin, though, with a story. Actually, let me begin with a couple of stories, just some examples of the kinds of people that I met. Christy Moore was born on a small island on the coast of Georgia, and Christy hated school. Actually, she used to pretend to be sick and almost like force herself to throw up as a kindergartner on the school bus so she didn't have to go to school. She managed to suffer through school, but as she became an adolescent and then a teenager, she began to spend more time away from school. She became a cheerleader, she became interested in boys, and she lost all interest in her studies. And then, out of nowhere, she got pregnant the summer before her junior year in high school. She said to her boyfriend that she wanted to keep the baby and he could stay around or not. And he said, of course I'm going to stay around. So he drops out of college, gets a job at Kentucky Fried Chicken. She drops out of school. They get married. They move into a small house. She gets a paper route. She begins to raise this child. Over the course of the next 5 years, Christy goes on to have 3 children. Christy and her husband kind of work through a series of small jobs. They actually have to change churches because the Baptist church that they're members of actually disowns them because of the out-of-wedlock pregnancy. They ultimately buy a small Japanese restaurant, and they're just getting their tiptoes into the middle class when her husband gets seriously ill with a gastric illness. And she realizes that they are about to tumble out of the middle class, and this is the nightmare, and that they need to get some sort of security and insurance. And so one day, Christy is taking her second youngest child to the library for toddler time, and the toddler goes toddling off to be with the teacher, and Christy reaches over and grabs a book. And the book is Wuthering Heights. She actually has to read it twice because she doesn't understand what's going on in the story. And then she puts it back and she grabs the next one, and it's To Kill a Mockingbird. And she begins over the coming months to slowly work her way through all of the classics that happen to be on the shelf next to the comfy chair because at the time she's pregnant with her 3rd child. And it's there that she finds her answer. Christy is going to go back to school. So on the day she drops her youngest child off in kindergarten, she drives to the local university, she enrolls, she begins, after the first class, she's with people who were 20 years younger, they're all sort of nodding along, and she realizes she doesn't know. She goes, she sits in her car and she cries between every class. God, give me the strength to have an understanding of what I'm learning. But she does it. She makes flashcards. She studies at the baseball games and the ballet practices. She studies her flashcards even at Disney World. She tells me, and then she manages to get her degree in respiratory illnesses. And then she goes on and gets a master's degree. And then she goes on to enroll in an online PhD program and adult education. And on one stormy, steaming August day, she puts herself in a cap and a gown. She marches down and she earns her doctorate. Christy Moore, the 5-year-old who never wanted to go to school, has done the unimaginable. She's gone from GED to PhD, and she now has a job counseling non-traditional students that they can find their way back to school. And just one more quick story. I think I'll tell the story of Devon Goodwin. Devon was born in inner city Pittsburgh in a broken family. And he also never particularly liked school, but he loved biology and he loved botany. The school gave him control of the local, allowed him to build in this school a greenhouse. And when he goes through high school, he decides he wants to go to school where he can study botany and he can also wrestle. He's like, there's only 2 places that have a program. One is Harvard, and he says, I don't think I can go there. And a school he finds in North Carolina. So he goes down to North Carolina, he enrolls, he quickly discovers that he doesn't really want to do the regimen where he can keep his scholarship on the wrestling team. And so he steps down and he suddenly runs out of money. He has to drop out of school. And he's on the verge of dropping out of school when he sees a sign that the Army is recruiting people. And so he goes to the enlisting station and they say that they'll pay him to go to school if he trains with the Army, and after he's in the Army, he gets out. And so he takes the money, he enrolls in the school, he has to drop out, I think, a few semesters before graduating. He joins the Army. They send him to Qatar, and he says, "Oh, no worry, because I'm just driving a truck." He says to his mother, "I'm not going to be in harm's way." And then his sergeant comes in that night and says, "We're going to Baghdad." And he goes to Baghdad, and one day doesn't feel like he should drive the truck, and his commanding officer says, "Then you get in the passenger side." In the passenger side, they roll over an IED and a tremendous explosion. And so Devon is airlifted back to the United States. He's suffered a traumatic brain injury. He actually becomes narcoleptic. And his transition advisor, going back to life, says, "You're never going to be able to read again." He says, "I don't believe you." He drops out of the program. He goes back to school. He re-enrolls, but nobody's going to give him a job because he's a narcoleptic. And then one day he hears about a doctor who has some farmland he wants to farm. He goes to apply for this job. He sticks his hands in the soil and he remembers, this is what brought me life as a child. And today, not only does he manage farmland in North Carolina, he actually runs a nonprofit to take inner city children and teach them about the power of botany and the power of plants and the power of farming to give you life. So what did I learn from looking through hundreds of stories like this and coding them for themes and ideas that can help all of us? The most important thing I learned, I would say, is three things. Number one, the idea of the linear life is dead. The linear life is the idea that we're going to have one job, one home, one relationship, one spirituality, one source of happiness from adolescence to assisted living. That linear life has been replaced by what I call the nonlinear life. And that nonlinear life involves many more ups and downs and twists and turns. There was a powerful moment early on in this process where one day I went to, actually it was at my own bookshelf, to pull out a book. And what happened is I ended up with the book, sure enough, with the book in my hand. But it was one of those moments like you'd see in a child's novel where it felt like the bookshelf itself opened, and on the other side was an entire room with a whole world that I didn't know was there. It turns out, by the way, that Dan Brown, who wrote the Da Vinci Code, actually has one of those moving shelves in his castle in France. And what was in that other room was this set of ideas that was entirely new to me. And that set of ideas is that the way we look at the world affects how we look at our lives. So I mentioned Walking the Bible before, and that series of books I wrote about the ancient world. So Walking the Bible, Abraham, where God was born. I wrote a book about Moses and his influence on America called America's Prophet, and a book about Adam and Eve and how it's actually a love story called The First Love Story. Well, in the ancient world, they did not have linear time. The way they understood the world was on the agricultural model, that the economy was based on cycles of the weather, okay? And so just as the economy and life was cyclical, because there's no clocks, there's no watches, there's no time, they thought that the human life itself was cyclical. And it was our role not, in effect, to have unique, personal, individualistic lives, but to kind of recreate this cyclical path of the gods. Well, the Bible comes along, and in the West at least, introduces the idea of linear time. So if you think about the story in the Hebrew Bible, you have Adam and Eve. Like all cultures have had origin stories. But in all the origin stories before the Hebrew Bible, it was the gods who created the world, and humans are not named. So not only are humans centrally involved in the biblical origin story, they actually have names, Adam and Eve, and they have stories, and they have personalities, okay? And their actions. And then, of course, we go from Adam and Eve, then we go to their children, Cain and Abel. There's surely a story there. And then Noah. And then with Abraham begins this linear path that in the biblical account leads all the way through the Hebrew Bible, through the prophets, ultimately through Jesus, and on down to today. So that's a linear model. And by the Middle Ages, they had taken this linear model and they said that the human life was a staircase up to middle age. So you peak in middle age, and then it's down a series of steps from there. Men and women in the Middle Ages had different paths, but it was the same shape. So it's not until the birth of science in the middle of the 19th century that the idea of a linear path of progress gets introduced. And this idea reflects what was the understanding of the economic shape, if you will, of progress in the industrial age. And what is that? That's the assembly line, okay? That's the conveyor belt. That's this moving arrow of progress. And if you look at the first century of psychology, everything follows this linear path, right? So you have Piaget with the stages of development of a child. You have Freud with his psychosexual stages of development. You have Erikson, who's part Goy, part Jew, feels estranged in Germany, comes to America. Erikson introduces the idea of the 8 stages of moral development, and he's actually explicit about it that it was modeled on the assembly line and the conveyor belt. Okay, the 5 stages of grief, the hero's journey, these are all linear constructs of human development. Even the idea of human development suggests that there's a linear path. Now, this reaches its peak in the late 20th century with this idea of the midlife crisis. And the story itself is actually worth pausing on to know. So the idea of a midlife crisis was first invented by an anthropologist named Elliot Jacques, who introduces this idea in the 50s to a group of academics in London. And they actually reject the idea because it sounds kind of kooky. But he dismisses it, but brings it back in the 60s and writes a paper about the idea of the midlife crisis. 2 academics in the United States, Roger Gould at UCLA and Dan Levinson at Yale, in the early 1970s begin to do research on this. And a then not so well known, but emerging kind of pop journalism star named Gail Sheehy learns about this research and writes an article in New York Magazine quoting Dan Levinson and using the research from Roger Gould from UCLA and writes this idea about the midlife crisis. And then, as you all know, she writes a book called Passages that is published on July 4th in 1776 and becomes this massive book. It sells tens of millions of copies, and many people in this audience will have either heard of it or read it or know someone who read it. And after that, the idea of the midlife crisis isn't just an idea, it's just a fact. Even in my conversations decades later, people would say, well, my first midlife crisis at 27 or my second midlife crisis at 59. And that begins to suggest the problem with this idea. So Sheehy's idea is that everybody goes through the same thing in their 20s and then the same thing in their 30s and has a midlife crisis between 39 and 44 and a half. The problem is that this idea is complete bunk. Okay, so there's a series of problems. If you go all the way back to Jacques, back in the early 1960s, he didn't actually talk to anybody when he was coming up with this idea. He actually read biographies of famous people, but not all famous people, only men. And in fact, he wrote in his piece that he wasn't going to talk to women because, they had menopause, and that kind of threw off his stages and understanding of the midlife crisis. Hello? If you're not even going to talk to women because menopause throws it off, and that's half the population, maybe this idea needs to be re-examined. And so Gould talks to a lot of people. Dan Levinson talked to only 40 people, only in New Haven. I lived in New Haven. It's a wonderful place, but it's not all of humanity, and only men. And in fact, when Gail Sheehy wrote her original piece in New York Magazine, she quoted Levinson. She didn't even credit Roger Gould. Roger Gould sued her for plagiarism and won. And Gail Sheehy, who was a single mom at the time, had no money. So she said, okay, I'll give him 10% of the book. I'm going to write about it. And then Passages went on to sell 20 million copies. And it was maybe the most successful negotiation of a plagiarism compensation ever done in human history. So the core problem is this is not how humans live. We only have to talk about the pandemic to realize if you are that everybody in the pandemic has been suffering from a crisis, if you will, or a challenging time at a minimum. Well, if you're between 39 and 44 and a half, you're having a midlife crisis. But if you're between 27 and 31 and a half, you're also having a crisis. And if you're between 75 and 84, you're also having a crisis, or even a teenager like my children are now. So this idea that all of our challenges in life only happen around birthdays that end in 0 is misleading at best and dangerous at worst. But then what has happened in the 21st century? What's happened in the 21st century is that we have now understood that life doesn't follow linear arrows of progress. In fact, we have chaos theory, we have network theory, we have complexity, that life is complex and not controlled or simple. So we now understand that life has periods of stability and then instability, periodicity and non-periodicity. But what's happened is we haven't changed how we understand our lives. So what's happened right now is that we have nonlinear lives, but we have linear expectations, but nonlinear lives. And those of us of a certain age, though, are still haunted by this ghost of linearity. So back to my 3 things that I learned in this process. Number 1, the linear life is dead. Number 2, the nonlinear life involves many more life transitions. So my research shows that in the course of our lives, we go through 36 disruptive events. I call these disruptors. Okay, they can be anything. They can be small, from a fender bender to spraining your ankle, or they can be large, like losing a loved one or losing your job. So these disruptors, they fall into 5 categories. They have to do with our relationships, they have to do with our work, they have to do with our identity, they have to do with our beliefs. And so these are disruptors that we face basically one every 12 to 18 months. And most of these we get through relatively well. Turns out we're pretty good at navigating change. We make some adjustments, we tweak our story, we rally on our friends, we lean on our loved ones, we make some changes, we move on. But 1 in 10 of these changes, 1 in 10 of these disruptors becomes a much bigger change. And this is what I call a lifequake. Okay? And we have 3 to 5 lifequakes in the course of our lives. Okay? And they take, on average, 5 years to navigate a lifequake. So if you think 3 to 5 in the course of our lives, they take 4, 5, or 6 years, that's 25 years. That's half of our adult lives. We are going through a life transition. And that's why the third and most important lesson I learned is that life transitions are a skill that we can and must master. As long as we're going to spend half of our lives going through this, a life transition turns out to be a lifelong sport that no one is teaching us how to play. The last major book on life transitions was 40 years ago in the 1970s. And yet now it turns out to be the most urgent life skill that any of us can navigate. So what I want to talk about in the next few minutes before we open this up for questions is what I learned about life transitions and how all of us can learn to get better at them and navigate them more effectively. So the first lesson actually may be the most important. So when I looked at these life transitions, I decided to sort of try to understand, when I looked at these lifequakes, I decided to try to understand them more fully. And so I analyzed them on basically 2 axes. The first was, were these life transitions voluntary or involuntary? And it turned out that 53% were involuntary and 47% were voluntary. So what's an involuntary lifequake? An involuntary lifequake is a diagnosis, right? A downsizing, okay? Your spouse cheats on you. That's an involuntary lifequake. A voluntary lifequake is you choose to step down from your job and move to Florida and start a B&B or an Airbnb. You choose to change religions. You choose to run for political office. You choose to cheat on your spouse. So what was interesting is that I looked at this divide, 53-47, and I thought, well, 47% of our lifequakes are voluntary. Like, we are embracing the opportunities of the nonlinear life. Well, as it turns out, I had a bunch of millennials on my team who were helping me code, and they looked at this finding and they were like, whoa, 53% are involuntary? Like, I can't control my life. All my planning is not going to work. That actually leads to an interesting side point here, which is that those of us, let's just say, who are 50 plus, who lived most of the formative years of our lives in the 20th century, we grew up with this kind of linear construct I was talking about earlier. We're still haunted by the ghost of linearity. A lot of people, particularly people 40 minus, they have grown up at this time when there's much more fluidity. They know that the average person will have 11.7 jobs and 12.3 moves. And what that often creates, if I could go around and talk to each of you who's with us tonight, my guess is that some of you will experience what I call a transition gap. Like, people 50 plus look at their children or grandchildren in their 20s, say, or 30s and say, wait a minute, you're having a baby before you get married, or like you're moving to a new town before you know what you're doing? Like, they're much more embracing of this nonlinearity, and the parents just simply don't understand that they're the ones who are kind of seizing the opportunities of the moment, and in some ways we're the ones, those of us of a certain age, who are not as understanding or recognizing or even embracing of these opportunities of nonlinearity. Okay, so that was the first axis that I looked at, voluntary and involuntary. Then, interestingly enough, I looked at personal versus collective. Okay, so a personal lifequake would be something that affects your family. Your house burns down, or you have somebody facing an addiction, or you have somebody facing an anxiety disorder. Like, that's a personal, for the most part, a personal lifequake. A collective lifequake would be a hurricane, I'll use because I grew up on the coast, a hurricane that kind of damages an entire town, okay? 9/11 came up frequently. And here it was interesting because 92% of the life quakes I looked at were personal and only 8% were collective. And so I looked at this and I thought, I've analyzed the wrong question. Like, that's not it. 5347 is interesting, 92.8 is not. And then I created a metrics, and the lowest category all was personal involuntary. And in fact, there's a line in Life is in the Transitions where I say, had I done these conversations a century ago, when we had 2 world wars, depression, civil rights, women's rights, whatever it might be, personal involuntary, collective involuntary life quakes would have been much more popular. And then lo and behold, what is the pandemic but a collective involuntary life quake? And so that leads to kind of the big point that I want to make here, is that the life quake can be voluntary or involuntary, but the life transition that grows out of it must be voluntary. You must choose to lean in and take the steps that allow you to go through it. And so I just want to talk for a second, and then we're going to open this up for questions about what those steps involve. And the most important thing to know is that a life transition has a shape to it. It has a series of phases, okay? So once you choose to go in, what you discover, what people get into, what they think, one of two things, like, I'm gonna make a 212 item to-do list, and I'm gonna get through this life transition in the weekend, and I'm gonna get a gold medal, like, this is my wife, I'm gonna be the greatest at it. Or people are like, I'm in a fetal position under my covers, and no one's ever been through this, and woe is me, and I just can't get out of bed. Look at enough of these, though, and certain patterns begin to appear. And the first is that life transitions involve 3 phases. The first is the long goodbye, where you accept that it's an emotional experience, and you use rituals to sort of say goodbye to the past. The second is a messy middle. This is the wilderness, the Israelites in the wilderness, if you will. This is the wilderness phase where you shed certain habits and you begin to create new ones. And then the last phase is the new beginning, when you unveil your new self and you update and tell a new story. Now, the idea of life transitions was invented a century ago by an anthropologist named Arnold van Gennep. And he's the first person who talked about this idea of phases. And he and everybody else for a century said, you must first, say goodbye to the past, and then you go into what I call the messy middle, and then you go to the new beginning. That turns out to be wrong. Each of us is good at one of these phases and bad at one of these phases. Like, maybe you like the emotions and accepting that it's painful, and you're a good friend to people who go through emotional times, and you're very emotionally sensitive. You're probably really good at the long goodbye. But that means probably that you're not so good at the messy middle or the new beginning. Or maybe you're, as I just said earlier, a list maker, like a to-do person. You like to get up and go do things. You may be great at the messy middle. I mean, that's, in fact, 47% of the people, half the people find that to be their strongest phase. But other people find the long goodbye to be difficult. In fact, if you look at the pandemic, I think one of the things that's interesting is that we had kind of a crisis of the long goodbye. Like, we thought, oh, we'll go inside, we'll mitigate for a month, and we'll go back to the new normal. Well, it turns out that's not what's happened at all. We're not going back. We're going to a new place entirely. And in fact, the process that allows you to say goodbye, to navigate that messy middle, and to go into the new beginning, that's a life transition. And so the last thing I want to say before we bring Maria back on and we talk about what specific questions you might have is I want to go back to that story that we all have that's bouncing around in the back of our heads. And that story is shaped in its kind of most kind of visceral and emotional way by the earliest stories we hear. So what are the earliest stories we hear? They're fairy tales. And what is it that makes a fairy tale? We think of it as there's a hero and there's a happy ending. But that's not what makes it a fairy tale. What makes it a fairy tale is the woods that the hero has to get through in order to get to the happy ending. And what is it that appears in the woods? It's a wolf. It's a wolf, or it's an ogre, or it's a dragon, or it's a downsizing, or a tornado, or a death, or a pandemic. And our instinct when we hear these stories is to want to shield our eyes. We don't want the hero to suffer. We don't want it to be challenging. But the thing that makes it a hero is that the hero has to get over, around, or through, or somehow get past the wolf. The Italians have a wonderful expression, lupus in fabula. Lupus is wolf. Fabula is fairy tale. The fabula is our life when everything's going well and it's just sunny and perfect and this is the life we all want. But the lupus is the wolf. And lupus in fabula in Italian means speak of the devil. Just when everything is going swimmingly, along comes the wolf to foul it up. But here's what I've learned. You can't shield your eyes when the scary parts start, because that's when the heroes are made. And if there's one thing I've learned from talking to person after person about their story, is that they do get through the woods. They do get around the wolf. And they do become the hero of their own story. And that's the most important skill of all. So with that, I will pause. I will ask our great control room to bring Maria back on, if that's how it's going to work. Hi there, Maria. And
what a segue!
Exactly. Look at this incredible tech skills we've got going on in South Florida tonight. So, what's on your mind, or what's on our gatherings minds, and how can I help?
Get them for a minute. I just gotta tell you, I wrote down, it's so funny, out of your whole book, this quote: "Without the wolf, the whole thing's merely a walk in the woods." Favorite lines of your book. So when you said that, I thought, she still got it. But I'm going to take it off a little bit. We're going to wait and see what people have to say. You almost answered this question, but I think I brought this up earlier with you a little bit. So many people you spoke to in the book made very dramatic changes. They energetic, enthusiastic. They were galvanized in a way by the disruptions in their lives and initiated these changes eventually. But what about people like most of us, who just get frozen by change, who want to stay under the covers, and it's hard for them to, like you say, lean into it? That sounds good, but how do you get from point A to point B? I think it's interesting. It was almost intimidating how powerful these people were.
So let me, first of all, I love that question, and I think a lot of people do wonder that. So let me start with the good news, and then we'll talk about the practical. The good news is 90% of the people that I spoke to said they got through their difficult time. And that's a powerful number, right? And in fact, some of the people I talked to were still in the transition, so that's why they didn't do it. So the first thing I want to say is that people are very good at this. The second thing I want to say is that I identified, as you know, so there's these 3 phases, right? The long goodbye, the messy middle, the new beginning, but there turn out to be 7 tools that people use to get through these times. And everybody does some of them naturally, but no one does all of them. Everybody kind of wants to get better in some way. So let's just talk about the emotions, talk about some of these stages. And so, so if you are so the tools, there's 7 of them. Most of them are attached to a phase, right? So the first phase is that we've talked about is the long goodbye. You may not do it first, but it's the first in the kind of order of this, and it's totally fine if you don't want to do it first. And the first is really, I think, addresses this person under the covers, which is, what is the emotion that you're going through? Like, I looked 225 people in the eye, and I said, what's the biggest emotion you struggled with in your life transition? The most common answer, fear. How am I going to get through it? How am I going to live without money? How am I going to live without this loved one? What am I going to do without my legs? And I've just lost my legs in a biking accident north of Grand Rapids as someone that I spoke to. So fear is the number one feeling that people struggle with. The second, sadness. I miss having my job. I miss having my loved one. I miss being able to hug my grandchild, but I can't because I'm forced to be in quarantine. So just plain sadness. The third was interesting for me. It was shame. I'm ashamed by what I did when I drank too much. I'm ashamed that I was working too hard and ignored my children when they were growing up. I'm ashamed that I have to ask for help. I'm ashamed that I have a child who's got an anxiety disorder. So when I run into someone at the supermarket and they say, how are the kids? I can't say that my child can't keep their job. So this, I think, gets to the heart of your question about being under the covers. So let's just talk about death for a second, which of course is all around us, having lost 550,000 Americans in the last 365 days. And that is, there's a difference between grief and mourning, right? So grief is the feeling. Mourning is what you do in response to the feeling. Okay, so having identified, so the first of my tools is to accept that it's an emotional experience. If you're under the covers, it's an emotional experience. And frankly, if you've made a 222 item to-do list and you're running around frantically, that also suggests that there's kind of untapped emotions going on there. So how do people get through the emotions? That's the second skill, which is mark it. Is that people do different things. Some people write down their feelings. I talked to a lot of people, Gina Zach, who left a job with Verizon and moved to Maine to take care of second homes. Like, she wrote down her feelings and her goals by her bed, so every morning she would see it. Some people do what, say, I would do in a situation like this, is like they buckle down. Like, okay, there's emotions going on. Like, I'm going to go back to work and like try to keep them, out of the room and in the closet until they just burst out and I can't deal with them. But 80%, 80 people, in response to entering a life transition, use a ritual in some way. As you know, this is in the book. Like, they light a candle, they sing a song, they make an altar, they put a photo of a loved one in a book, they bury something in the backyard. I talked to a woman, they go to a sweat. I talked to a man who was in a loveless marriage for a long period for 3 decades, divorced his wife, came out as gay. He went to a sweat lodge, literally, to kind of sweat out the untapped emotions. I talked to a woman, Lisa Ray Rosenberg. She was in her late 30s at the time. She had an awful year. She had a falling out with her mother. She donated an organ to her brother, and she went on 49 first dates. She actually made a spreadsheet of everything she wore on the first date, because she only went on 8 second dates, and she didn't want to wear the same thing on the second date that she'd worn on the first date. And she's like, this isn't working. What's her biggest fear? Heights? She jumps out of an airplane. A year later, she's married with a child. So people use these rituals as a kind of a way to say to themselves and to everyone around them, I'm going through a transition. This is a difficult time, but I'm going to be very open about it. So that's just 2 of the tools. And 2 more I'll mention. I want to get to more questions, but 2 more I'll mention when you get into this messy middle is you shed certain habits. Some of them may be things that you don't like about yourself. Maybe you're a people pleaser, right? Maybe you worked too hard. I talked to a man who retired in South Florida, actually, from Wisconsin, and he used to wear scrubs every day. He was a distinguished pediatric specialty that's not coming to me right now. And when he's like, I retired, he's like, I stopped wearing my scrubs during the day. I wear them to sleep, take them off in the morning, put on clothes, and then say to my wife, give me a honey-do list, because I was I was not the father or the grandfather that I wanted to be. So here's, using some ritual, shedding this habit, and that leads to this other thing that people do that I frankly was surprised by, which is that they turn to astonishing acts of creativity. They sing, they dance, they paint. I talked to a woman who retired from 30 years of being a chemistry professor, an Asian American woman in Alabama. And then she got stomach cancer and lost large parts of her stomach. And so her eating habits changed. Her husband, she was the caretaker. Husband didn't want to take care of her. She ditches the husband. She retires, and she's looking like at a pamphlet one day in a restaurant that talks about ballet. And she goes, I always wanted to be a ballerina, and my mother wouldn't let me. So she starts adult ballet, okay, in her 60s. Like, people turn to incredible acts of creativity. Like, what was the number 1 cliche a year ago? What was the number 1 cliche? What did people do when the pandemic hit? They started to bake, right? We were going to sourdough our way through it, right? Remember that? Like, I may have been the least surprised person in America, because that little act, Maria, of saying, I'm going to get out from under the covers. I'm going to bake a blueberry muffin or a loaf of sourdough, because you couldn't get, remember, you couldn't get yeast up in the Northeast, at least. That little act of imagining that little loaf of bread and then getting your hands dirty and then taking it out of the oven and eating it, that's the little magical trick that our bodies and minds and spirits play on us, that allows us to imagine, hey, it was worth it to get out of bed to make the bread. It's worth it to get out of bed and make a new life, even though this is a difficult time.
So the first step is take small ones.
Exactly. Small wins.
Yeah. And I have another. Carter, I know that you say it's mastering change at any age. That's part of the title. Do you think it's harder for people to overcome life quakes the older they are? When they have fewer years left, less income potential, job opportunities, it feels like the choices can shrink a little. Did you find in your research that people manage upheavals as they get older?
I love that question. And let me just put some mud on my own face here and say there's a couple of things that I just got flat wrong. When I set out on this project, I had a certain number of assumptions. My first assumption is that it would be a different set of tools if you were facing a medical issue versus a job loss issue versus an addiction issue versus a, say, change of religiosity or change in your political viewpoints. And that, I was flat wrong. It turns out that the skills are the same. And the second was this idea that it would be easier or harder. So I do not think that the age that you are is the reason that it might appear to be more difficult. Okay, so I think it might appear to be more difficult in some ways, but I'm going to suggest in a second that it's a lot easier in other ways. The ways in which I think it's more difficult is that people who are older now, what I've now come to realize is that this whole thing, I did that detour earlier about, because I'm still so mesmerized by learning this and I didn't know it, this idea that in the ancient world they thought life was a cycle, that in the Middle Ages, let's look at the Middle Ages, they think life peaks at middle age and then is straight downhill, okay? That's no new love at 40, no moving to Florida, all these things I said. And then we grew up in the 20th century with the exact opposite idea, which is that middle age is the bottom. That shows, I think, in a fundamental way, that this is a completely artificial construct. That 200, 300 years ago, or 400 years ago, they think middle age is the top, and 100 years ago, we think it's the bottom. I think that the problem that older people have is this idea I alluded to earlier, that we're still haunted by the ghost of linearity. We still believe that our life was supposed to go a certain way and it's not going a certain way. And so we're thrown for that. I think that's the primary challenge that older people have. Not that they're a certain age, but that they have deeply misleading expectations that were fed to us by academia and popular culture and movies and books and religions and all of these things. Having said that, there's great opportunities to be older. And that, just to quickly get into this, is first of all, the research is very clear that as you get older, a lot of those things that matter to you, like money and status, etc., begin to fade away, and our own relationships, like all these relationships we have, I have teenagers, right? Which means I'm embedded in this world of like my children's friends and school events. And so we have a lot of these kind of casual friends. And as we get older, there's strengths and weaknesses to that tends to melt away. And we tend to spend time with the people that we care about. Okay. But the other thing that happens, and I just will be brief about this because so we can see if we can squeeze in a few more questions before we let people go into their evenings, is that we have to, if you go back 100 years ago, we had to do what our parents wanted us to do, live where our parents wanted us to live, believe where our parents wanted to what our parents wanted us to believe, love who our parents wanted us to love. All that's gone away. We can live where we want to, do what we want to, believe what we want to, love whom we want to. That's a great opportunity, but it's a kind of peril. We get writer's block writing the story of our lives. But what we do, we have 3 building blocks that give us identity. I call these the ABCs of meaning. The A is agency, what we do, make, create. The B is belonging, our friends, relationships, loved ones, co-religionists, neighbors. That's the B, belonging. Agency, belonging. And the C is cause, a calling, something higher than ourselves. And so what tends to happen in these life quakes is that we readjust these ABC. We all have all 3 of them in us. We readjust. So maybe we've worked very hard and we adjust and we spend more time with our loved ones. Maybe we're caring for an aging relative, a dying parent or a young child or children, And then that period ends and we want to give back. Maybe we've been giving back and we burn out and we want to write, stories or write a memoir of our own lives. So what tends to happen as we get older is that we shapeshift, as I call it, we adjust and we rebalance our lives so that different things are important to us. That is a challenge, but that's also the great gift of being alive today, which is you're not stuck in the middle age framework where there's nothing, or the 20th century. Life is nonlinear. You can make any choice you want whenever you want. It may be hard because it's not what you expected, but the blessing is what you've got.
Positive, which probably is a natural for my next question. Is there any common characteristic that you found in people who were particularly successful at navigating these life quakes? Were you able to narrow down certain qualities they had that were helpful?
I think at its core, like the most important skill that we have, that we need in times like this, is to see these events as fundamentally a narrative event. Okay, the way the phrase that I like, it's a sort of a forgotten phrase from one academic came up with this in the 1980s, and I'm trying to revive it. Is the key to it, I think, is to look at a life quake or a life transition as an autobiographical occasion. So an autobiographical occasion, originally the term meant a job interview is an auto, or a first date, or the first visit to a doctor where you tell your story. Okay, but all of these events are autobiographical occasions. And the fundamental task in an autobiographical occasion in a life quake, is to revisit and revise and retell our life story. I had a life, this was the story I told, along came a pandemic, and this changed and that changed, and it was difficult at times. I had some benefits, I learned to bake, and I drew, closer to my loved ones. But I was also lonely and it was sad and I lost some money, but then I was able to read, is to find something in there so that you can add a new chapter to your life story. That's the fundamental act. That was my life. There was a rupture. Now I add a new story and I'm ready for whatever story came up. And so as I see that we've been joined here again and signaling that we're going to end this evening, so I just want to make a couple of points at the end. First of all, I want to thank you guys for inviting me, and I want to speak on behalf of everybody joining us tonight and who's going to be joining in the coming days to the music and ideas and arts and literature that you're going to celebrate, by saying thank you for pulling this off in an incredibly difficult time. We all know that this was a transition as you transition from a program that had been around for a very long time into this virtual. So, hats off to you. This proves transitions can be done. So I want to congratulate you. I want to thank you for including me, and say, if anybody, if you have a question I answered, I'm on all the social medias at Bruce Feiler. And if you go to my website at brucefeiler.com, not only can you send me a question, but you can look in the middle. There's a kind of a tic-tac-toe board. In the middle, if you click on the yellow one, I have a way that I will send you a question every week for you or a loved one to answer and do the kind of storytelling project I did with my dad. That's proven to be very popular. But the last thing I just want to say is, we're all struggling now. Everybody's laying awake at night or got a cup of coffee this morning and looked out the window and wondered about you or someone you live with or someone you love going through a challenging time. And what I want to say is, I was where you are. And as you said, Cynthia, I went out and met these people, many of whom were in life situations that I could never even imagine. They gave me hope. Not just that I could get through it in an abstract way, but they gave me practical things that I could do tonight or tomorrow, so that whatever you're going through, whatever someone you love is going through, we can make it go a little bit better, a little bit more effectively, and a little more smoothly. So if you come on this journey with me, I think you'll be changed. I think you'll be inspired. And I think it will help you get through it. There is knowledge out there. We can get past the wolves together.
Wow. Thank you. Thank you, Marie. That was great. And I think we all ought to be clicking on your little yellow button. That sounds wonderful. And your message is what you're saying is just really what we all need right now. So thank you. And I want to remind everybody that Thursday night we will have Sonia Shaw. She will be our last speaker. And then Saturday night we have the Boca All-Stars concert. And Sunday night we have Nestor Torres. And that's that's pretty exciting days ahead too. Thank you, Bruce. Thank you, Marie.
My pleasure.
So much.